The Right to Love, Upfront Magazine. The sheriff and his men arrived at 2 in the morning. Richard Loving heard the knocking, but before he could get out of bed, the officers broke through the door and burst into the bedroom. Later, Mildred Loving recalled the sudden panic, the flashlights in her face. They asked Richard who I was. I said, "I'm his wife." The sheriff said, "Not around here, you're not." Richard, who was white, and Mildred, who was black and Native American, were a married couple. And in 1958 in Caroline County, Virginia, that was a crime. The marriage violated Virginia's 1924 Racial Integrity Act, which made it unlawful for any white person in this state to marry anyone except a white person. For their offense, the Lovings were exiled from their home state and nearly imprisoned. But they fought back in court, and their case eventually made it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1967, the justices ruled in their favor, erasing laws in 16 states that ban interracial marriage. 50 years later, Loving versus Virginia continues to help protect the rights of all Americans to marry anyone that they want. Slavery and the 14th Amendment. By the time the Lovings were arrested, nearly a century had passed since the ratification of the 14th Amendment in 1868. It guaranteed equal protection of the laws to all Americans regardless of race. Yet, African Americans continued to face many barriers in equality. This is especially true for the formerly slaveholding South. There, local and state Jim Crow laws discriminated against blacks in nearly every facet of life. Among these laws were bans on interracial marriage. The bans had been in the books in most U.S. states at one point or another, but the rules and how they were enforced varied from state to state. In the South, authorities tended to crack down mostly on marriages between blacks and whites, especially if a man was black and a woman was white. Mixing all the time. My parents grew up within 3 or 4 miles of each other, Richard and Mildred's daughter, Peggy Loving, said in a 2011 documentary about the case. Mildred's brothers played music at parties Richard attended. Black and white families in Caroline County routinely helped harvest each other's crops. In that small world, it wasn't so incredible that Mildred Jeter and Richard Loving would meet and fall in love. People had been mixing all the time, so I didn't know any different, Mildred later said. I didn't know there was any law against it. Even so, Richard and Mildred knew that some people in their community felt threatened by racial mixing. When they got married in June of 1958, they did it quietly in Washington, D.C. About 5 weeks later, they were arrested back home, brought before Judge Leon Bazile in January of 1958. The Lovings feared being thrown into prison, so they pleaded guilty in exchange for a 1-year sentence. As part of the plea bargain, Bazile suspended the sentence, but under one condition. The Lovings would have to leave Virginia, the place they'd always called home, for 25 years. In early 1963, Mildred wrote to the U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy explaining their situation. Kennedy referred them to the American Civil Liberties Union. There, Mildred's letter reached the desk of a young lawyer named Bernard Cohen. Cohen immediately understood the challenges of this case. He knew it would likely take years to resolve and might go all the way to the Supreme Court. Cohen believed their chances of winning were high, made better by the plaintiff's last name. It was a very good omen, he said. I feel free. Cohen and his law partner appealed the case through the state and federal courts. At last, in April 1967, Loving versus Virginia reached the Supreme Court. By then, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 had been passed, and the court felt the time was right to take on a case about interracial marriage. The night before the lawyers made their arguments, Cohen asked Richard if there was anything he wanted the justices of the Supreme Court to know. He said, "Tell the court I love my wife, and it is just unfair that I can't live with her in Virginia." We will pick up with the last 2 paragraphs in the next recording.